Number 1. Harvey Weinstein, the man who owned Hollywood. There is a particular kind of power that exists in the entertainment industry, one that is invisible to most people, yet felt by everyone who enters its orbit. It is not written in any contract, and it does not appear on any organizational chart. It is simply understood. And for more than 3 decades, no one in Hollywood wielded that invisible power more completely, more deliberately, or more consequentially than Harvey Weinstein. Born on March 19, 1952, in Flushing, Queens, New York, Weinstein grew up in a working-class family and would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in the history of American cinema as the co-founder and co-chairman of Miramax Films and later the Weinstein Company. His journey from the outer boroughs of New York to the very summit of Hollywood is, on its surface, a story of ambition and vision. After college, Weinstein and his younger brother Bob organized rock concerts and comedy events, gradually building a small financial foundation. With that capital, Harvey realized his dream of opening their own production company, which they named Miramax after their parents, Miriam and Max. It was a humble, almost sentimental beginning, a family business named in honor of the people who raised them. But what Miramax became was anything but humble. Under Harvey Weinstein's leadership, the studio grew into one of the most influential forces in global cinema, responsible for some of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful films of its era. The company produced landmark hits including Pulp Fiction and Shakespeare in Love, and Weinstein's films won more than 80 Academy Awards over the course of his career. He was celebrated in the press, courted by politicians, and respected, or more precisely, feared, by nearly everyone in the industry he had helped build. He attended presidential fundraisers. He sat on the boards of major cultural institutions. He was, to all outward appearances, a titan of culture and commerce, a man who had used his talent and drive to elevate cinema and the artists who created it. But beneath that celebrated public image, and hidden behind an elaborate architecture of legal agreements, strategic relationships, and institutional silence, was a very different reality, one that dozens of women had been forced to live with in private while the world continued to applaud the man responsible for their suffering. The pattern, as it would eventually be documented in painstaking detail by investigative journalists and federal prosecutors, was both systematic and chilling. Prosecutors argued that Weinstein held enormous control over those working in television and film, deciding who was in and who was out, holding what they described as the golden ticket, the chance to make it or not, and that the word no was not something he was accustomed to hearing. Women who came to him seeking career opportunities, many of them young and new to the industry, would find themselves in private meetings, hotel rooms, private offices, film festival suites, where the professional encounter would take a deeply unwanted turn. The power imbalance was not incidental, it was the mechanism. A federal prosecutor described Weinstein as someone who used his power and influence to isolate women, trapping them in places where he would be alone with them, and abusing them. The same power and influence he used to make award-winning films now turned against the people who trusted him with their professional aspirations. For years, the women who experienced this found themselves with nowhere to turn. Speaking out against Harvey Weinstein meant risking everything in an industry where he could, and often did, determine the course of careers. And Weinstein knew this. He counted on it. His primary tools for ensuring silence were secret settlements and restrictive contracts. Non-disclosure agreements were used systematically. Women were required to sign broad confidentiality agreements prohibiting them from discussing Weinstein's personal behavior or the culture within his company, effectively trapping them in silence under the threat of severe financial penalties. On at least 2 occasions, settlements were funded not even through corporate accounts, but through personal bank accounts, a detail that underscores just how deliberate and personal the effort to contain the truth really was. As one of his accusers, Caitlin Delaney, would later state publicly, Harvey avoided accountability for decades, leveraging his power to hide behind a web of deceit. What made Weinstein's case particularly significant from a historical standpoint was not just the scale of the alleged conduct, but the way in which an entire industry had, through its silence and its structures, allowed it to continue. Executives knew, or had strong reason to suspect. Employees knew. Lawyers and agents knew. And yet the machine kept running, because the machine was profitable, and because dismantling it meant acknowledging an uncomfortable truth about how power functions in spaces where fame is currency. The reckoning, when it finally came, arrived in October 2017 through the work of investigative journalists at the New York Times and the New Yorker, whose reporting broke open a story that had been contained for decades. More than 80 women publicly accused Weinstein of misconduct spanning several decades, their accounts backed by audio recordings, internal memos, and meticulous documentation that formed the evidentiary foundation for legal action. The story swept through Hollywood like a tide that had been building for years, and it did not stop there. It became the catalyst for a global conversation about power, accountability, and the experiences of women in workplaces everywhere, a movement that came to be known as Me Too. For Weinstein himself, the legal consequences were substantial though complicated. He was convicted of sex crimes in both New York in 2020 and California in 2022. His New York rape conviction was overturned on appeal in 2024, and he faced a retrial in 2025, during which he was again convicted of a felony sex crime, though the jury was unable to reach a verdict on one charge and acquitted him on another. In Los Angeles, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison on sexual assault charges. As of the time of this writing, Weinstein remains incarcerated while legal proceedings continue. His story is not simply the story of one man's misconduct. It is the story of what happens when institutional power protects individual wrongdoing for long enough that the wrongdoing comes to feel, to those within the system, like simply the way things work. It took the courage of dozens of women, the persistence of investigative journalists, and ultimately the intervention of the criminal justice system to make clear that no amount of prestige, no number of Academy Awards, and no volume of industry connections places anyone beyond the reach of accountability. Harvey Weinstein had spent 30 years building an empire in which his word was law. It took the quiet, persistent voices of the women he had wronged to bring that empire down. Number 2. R. Kelly. The Pied Piper's Betrayal. There is a particular cruelty in being exploited by someone you admired, someone whose music had moved you, whose name had meant something to you, and whose interest in your life felt, at first, like the most extraordinary stroke of luck imaginable. For the young women and girls who encountered Robert Sylvester Kelly at the height of his fame, the experience of being noticed by one of the most celebrated R&B artists of his generation felt like a door opening onto a future they had only dared to dream about. What waited behind that door was something entirely different. Robert Sylvester Kelly was born on January 8, 1967, in Chicago, Illinois, the third of 4 children raised by his mother Joan Kelly in the Ida B. Wells public housing project in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. From a young age, Kelly's musical gifts were apparent. At 8 years old, he joined his local church choir, and his high school music teacher, Lena McClin, recognized his talent and encouraged him to pursue music seriously. He dropped out of high school to pursue a singing career, a gamble that paid off in extraordinary fashion. Through the 1990s, Kelly became one of the best-selling R&B artists in history, and his 1996 hit song, I Believe I Can Fly, earned him 3 Grammy Awards. He had more songs reach the top 40 of the Billboard singles chart than any other male solo artist of that decade. He was, by every commercial and critical measure, a genuine superstar, a man whose voice had become part of the cultural fabric of an era, whose music played at church services and graduation ceremonies, and in the homes of families who loved what he had created. And it was this image, this carefully maintained, widely beloved public identity, that became, according to federal prosecutors, the most powerful instrument in a decades-long pattern of exploitation. A federal prosecutor described Kelly as a man who for decades used his fame, his popularity, and a network of people at his disposal to target, groom, and exploit young girls, boys, and women, whose celebrity status meant he had his pick of young fans and who used every trick in a predator's handbook, approaching minors, grooming them and their families with promises of career assistance before exploiting them. The mechanism was almost always the same. Kelly or his associates would identify young aspiring artists, express interest in helping them develop their talents, and then use promises of love, a successful career, or other things of value to draw them in. False promises of success and fame were used to lure victims. Once recruited, Kelly frequently isolated them from their friends and families. One victim, Geronda Pace, testified that he confiscated her cell phone. Another, who went by Jane, testified that he discouraged all the women from communicating with or visiting their families by telling them they did not mean anything to their families. His entourage was reportedly ordered to recruit girls at malls and public venues while on tour, approaching young women with promises of connection to Kelly and opportunities in the music industry. One such young woman was Lizette Martinez, who met Kelly at a mall in Miami when she was 17 years old. A bodyguard gave her Kelly's phone number, and he invited her to dinner. She saw it as her big break. What followed was years of control and exploitation that she would spend decades working to process and, eventually, speak publicly about. What is particularly significant about the R. Kelly case, and what distinguished it from many other celebrity misconduct cases, was the sheer breadth and duration of the pattern, as well as the degree to which it was known and yet remained unaddressed for so long. Allegations against Kelly had circulated as early as the 1990s. In 1997, Tiffany Hawkins filed a complaint against Kelly alleging intentional sexual battery and sexual harassment while she was a minor, and the matter was reportedly settled for $250,000 the following year. Yet the music continued to play. The awards continued to arrive. The record label continued to promote him. The industry continued to look away. It was not until the 2019 Lifetime documentary series Surviving R. Kelly aired, drawing millions of viewers and featuring testimonies from women who described years of control and exploitation, that the cultural reckoning truly began. The six-part series drew an average of 1.9 million viewers and prompted a wave of public outrage, a boycott campaign, and ultimately accelerated the legal process that had long been delayed. For nearly 30 years, as prosecutors would later establish at trial, Kelly and his accomplices silenced his victims through bribery, intimidation, blackmail, and physical coercion, all while remaining confident they were immune to justice. The trial in Brooklyn's federal court in 2021 heard from more than 40 witnesses, and Kelly was convicted of all 9 counts against him: racketeering, sex trafficking, and sexual exploitation charges spanning decades. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the judge describing his conduct as being not about sex, but about violence, cruelty, and control. During the sentencing, one unnamed survivor addressed Kelly directly in court. She said he had made her do things that broke her spirit, that she had literally wished she would die because of how low he had made her feel. And she asked him, quietly and directly, whether he remembered. Kelly sat with his hands folded and his eyes downcast. He said nothing. As of 2025, R. Kelly is incarcerated at FCI Butner Medium 2, a federal prison in North Carolina, serving his sentences concurrently. The story of R. Kelly is a story about what happens when an industry decides that talent is more important than truth, and when the people most vulnerable to exploitation, young, aspiring, and dazzled by proximity to celebrity, are left without the protections they deserve. His victims waited decades for justice. They found it, ultimately, not because the system moved quickly, but because they refused to be silent forever. Number 3. Jimmy Savile, the man who groomed a nation. If the Harvey Weinstein case revealed how power operates within the entertainment industry, and the R. Kelly case showed how fame can be weaponized against the most vulnerable, the Jimmy Savile case revealed something even more unsettling: how an entire society can be deceived by a single individual for more than half a century, and how institutions that exist to protect people can, through negligence and misplaced deference, become the very structures through which exploitation is made possible. British television and radio personality Jimmy Savile received his knighthood in 1990, and in the eyes of his most loyal supporters, it was a fitting culmination to a career that had made him one of the most beloved public figures in the United Kingdom for decades. He hosted enormously popular BBC television programs, including Jim'll Fix It and Top of the Pops. He was a tireless charity fundraiser who raised an estimated £40 million for various causes over the course of his career. He had dined with prime ministers. He had access to Buckingham Palace. He was eccentric and larger than life and seemingly everywhere, a constant, cigar-chomping, platinum-haired presence in British homes for more than 5 decades. And according to what investigators would eventually uncover after his death in October 2011 at the age of 84, He was also someone who had been systematically exploiting his public image and institutional access to cause profound harm to an extraordinary number of people, most of them children and vulnerable adults, across a period that spanned most of his working life. A 3-month police investigation following his death yielded documentation of 214 offenses, including 34 rapes, committed over more than half a century, with most of his victims under the age of 18. Police described him as a prolific, predatory sex offender whose celebrity unlocked the doors of institutions across Britain. He used his access to hospitals as a volunteer porter and celebrity fundraiser to gain proximity to patients, abusing victims who ranged in age from 5 to 75 across 28 hospitals throughout the United Kingdom. The investigators who documented these findings described what Seville had constructed as one of the most elaborate and sustained patterns of institutional access ever recorded in a case of this nature. He had not simply taken advantage of opportunities as they arose. He had deliberately and strategically positioned himself within the institutions, hospitals, schools, rehabilitation centers, that held the most vulnerable people, using his celebrity status as both a key and a shield. Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, addressing Parliament after the reports were released, stated that Seville's celebrity status had allowed him to get away with offenses for decades, and called on institutions to ensure that the power of celebrity or money would never again blind people to repeated clear signals that vulnerable people were being harmed. At the Leeds General Infirmary alone, investigators documented 60 alleged incidents. At Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where Seville had been particularly active as a fundraiser, the findings detailed abuse of patients ranging from an 8-year-old boy recovering from surgery to a 19-year-old paralyzed woman. In some hospitals, records suggested that staff had been aware of concerns relating to Seville as early as 1973, yet no action was taken, allowing a pattern of conduct to continue for more than 20 years. The scale of the institutional failure was staggering. Seville had been able to move through hospitals with unsupervised access because of who he was, or rather, because of who people believed him to be. His public image as a generous charity worker and beloved entertainer had created a kind of social immunity, a widely shared reluctance to question or challenge someone who appeared to do so much good. Evidence from investigations showed that Seville had sought to acquire positions of institutional power from early in his charity work, specifically because those positions gave him access that would otherwise have been unavailable to him. He understood, with what investigators later described as a calculating and deliberate intelligence, that the more trusted he appeared, the less scrutiny he would face. The most chilling aspect of the Seville case may be this. He died in 2011 with his reputation largely intact. He was given an elaborate funeral that reflected his status as a popular entertainer and beloved fundraiser. It was only after his death, when the social protection of his celebrity could no longer function, that his victims felt safe enough to speak. Hundreds came forward. With each new finding, public acknowledgments of regret followed from co-workers at the BBC, administrators of hospitals where he had volunteered, and other celebrities who had been part of his social circle. Commander Peter Spindler, head of the Metropolitan Police Specialist Crimes Unit that led the investigation, said that Seville had been hiding in plain sight, and that his grooming of public trust was so complete that it could be said he had groomed an entire nation. Jimmy Seville never faced a courtroom. He never answered to a jury. He was never required to look his victims in the eye and hear the consequences of his conduct read aloud by a judge. That absence of formal justice has been one of the most painful elements of the case for the hundreds of survivors who came forward. But what the investigations did produce was something of lasting importance, a detailed, documented reckoning with exactly how institutional deference to celebrity can create the conditions for harm, and a public commitment to ensuring that the same conditions are never allowed to develop again. Number 4. Bill Cosby, America's dad, and the double life he led. There is something uniquely disorienting about the Bill Cosby case, something that sets it apart from nearly every other high-profile celebrity misconduct case of the modern era. It is not simply the scale of the allegations, though those allegations were extensive and spanned decades. It is the profound contrast between the public image and the private conduct, a contrast so extreme that for many people, the initial reaction upon hearing the allegations was not disbelief in the accusers, but something more complicated, a kind of cognitive dissonance, an inability to reconcile what they were being told with the person they had welcomed into their homes every week through a television screen. Bill Cosby was convicted in 2018 of drugging and molesting a woman, completing the spectacular late-life downfall of a comedian who broke racial barriers in Hollywood on his way to becoming known across America as America's Dad. That nickname was not hyperbole. For the better part of 2 decades, from the mid-1980s through the early 2000s, Cosby had occupied a unique place in American cultural life. His television program, The Cosby Show, which ran from 1984 to 1992, was one of the most watched programs in the history of American television. It presented a warm, educated, loving African-American family at a time when such representations were rare on mainstream television, and it did so with genuine warmth and humor that connected with audiences of all backgrounds. Cosby was not merely a comedian. He was a cultural figure, a man who had used his platform to speak about education, responsibility, and family values, who had earned multiple honorary degrees, who had made philanthropic contributions to historically black colleges and universities. The gap between that person and the person described in the legal proceedings that would eventually consume his later years was almost impossible for many people to process. Over 60 women have accused Cosby of various offenses, including rape, drug-facilitated sexual assault, sexual battery, child sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. Those allegations gained wider public traction in 2014 after fellow comedian Hannibal Buress mentioned them during a comedy set that subsequently went viral online. The accounts of the women who came forward described a remarkably consistent pattern. Cosby would meet them in professional contexts, casting meetings, mentorship conversations, industry gatherings, where the promise of his interest and support carried enormous professional weight. Many of the women who came forward had been young and aspiring when they first encountered him. Some had sought him out because of his stated interest in supporting talent, particularly black talent in an industry that offered limited opportunities. They trusted him because he was, to all appearances, exactly what he presented himself as being, a wise, experienced, generous figure in a world where such figures were rare. In the retrial, prosecutors put 5 other women on the witness stand who testified that Cosby had drugged and violated them. Their accounts delivered with detail and emotional precision that left the courtroom deeply affected. The criminal case that was ultimately prosecuted centered on Andrea Constant, a Temple University women's basketball administrator. She testified that Cosby had violated her at his Pennsylvania home in 2004 after she came to him for career advice. In his own deposition, taken years before the criminal case, Cosby had acknowledged obtaining Quaalude sedatives to give to women he wanted to have sex with. He also acknowledged giving pills to Constant before their sexual encounter, though he identified them as an over-the-counter cold medicine and insisted they were meant to help her relax. The jury, after hearing 2 weeks of testimony and deliberating for 14 hours, returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. Judge Stephen O'Neill, in sentencing Cosby, made a point that resonated far beyond the courtroom. Nobody is above the law because of where they live, who they are, wealth, fame, celebrity, or even philanthropy. Cosby was sentenced to between 3 and 10 years in state prison, branded a sexually violent predator, making him the first celebrity to be convicted and sentenced for a sex crime since the emergence of the Me Too movement. In June 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction on procedural grounds related to a prior non-prosecution agreement, and Cosby was released after serving nearly 3 years. However, legal proceedings against him have continued. In March 2026, Cosby was found guilty in a civil lawsuit of a 1972 sexual assault, with the victim awarded nearly $60 million in damages. The Bill Cosby case forced a difficult but necessary conversation about the nature of public trust and the degree to which an individual's contributions to culture, however genuine and however significant, can coexist with profound private harm. His victims had lived with their experiences for years, some for decades, in a world that found their accounts difficult to accept because the man they were describing did not match the man on the screen. That dissonance, that gap between the image and the reality, was itself a form of protection he carried for years. The courage of the women who ultimately spoke, who stood in courtrooms and gave testimony knowing the weight of the name they were speaking against, is the reason that protection eventually ran out. Number 5. Sean Diddy Combs. The Empire and What It Concealed. For more than 3 decades, Sean Combs occupied one of the most prominent positions in the global music industry. He was one of hip-hop's most opportunistic and successful entrepreneurs, spinning his hit-making talents into a broad business empire that included a record label, a fashion brand, a television network, deals with liquor companies, and a key role in a reality television program. He was credited with helping launch the careers of some of the most significant artists of the 1990s and 2000s, including the notorious B.I.G., Mary J. Blige, Faith Evans, and Usher. He was known for his extravagant white-themed parties, his business acumen, and his ability to shape popular culture in ways that crossed the boundaries of music, fashion, and entertainment. He appeared at major award ceremonies, collaborated with fashion designers, and cultivated a public image that combined creativity with entrepreneurial ambition. And for years, that image remained largely intact, even as allegations about his private conduct began to accumulate in ways that would, eventually, become impossible to contain. In November 2023, R&B singer Cassie Ventura filed a lawsuit against her former boyfriend Sean Combs, accusing him of years of abuse and sexual coercion. Since then, a further series of civil lawsuits were filed along similar lines. Then, in September 2024, federal authorities moved decisively. Combs was arrested at his Manhattan hotel, and a sex trafficking and racketeering indictment unsealed the following day accused him of using his business empire to coerce women into participating in sexual performances. The indictment alleged that over the course of approximately 20 years, Combs had engaged in a pattern of conduct involving sexual coercion, emotional and physical control, financial leverage, and the systematic silencing of those who might have spoken about what was occurring. According to prosecutors, Combs provided victims with monetary payments, career opportunities, and payment of rent and housing expenses, then threatened to take those benefits away if they resisted engaging in sexual acts at his direction. They also alleged that he tracked his victims, monitored their medical records, supplied them with controlled substances, and prevented them from leaving his home or hotel rooms. The trial, which began in May 2025, saw prosecutors call 34 witnesses, including former girlfriend Cassandra Cassie Ventura and another woman who testified under the pseudonym Jane. Both accused Combs of coercion, physical control, and emotional manipulation. Ventura had been signed to Combs' record label at the age of 19, and prosecutors argued that the professional relationship gave him significant leverage over her career and her choices. Hotel surveillance footage from 2016 showing an incident between Combs and Ventura was presented during the proceedings and became one of the most widely discussed elements of the trial. The defense argued throughout the proceedings that the encounters were consensual, part of a voluntary lifestyle, and that the prosecution was criminalizing behavior that both parties had agreed to. The jury deliberated for just over 2 days before returning a mixed verdict. Combs was acquitted of the most serious charges, including sex trafficking and racketeering, but was convicted on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, one each related to Ventura and to Jane. Each count carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Combs was denied bail following the verdict and remained incarcerated pending sentencing, which was scheduled for October 2025. The attorney for Cassie Ventura, in a statement following the verdict, emphasized that by coming forward with her experience, Ventura had paved the way for the jury to find Combs guilty on the prostitution charges, and that her courage in doing so had left an indelible mark both on the entertainment industry and on the broader conversation about accountability for those who hold power within it. The Sean Combs case, like the Weinstein case before it, revealed the degree to which an entertainment empire can function as both a legitimate business and, when the wrong person is at its center, a structure that enables control over those within its orbit. The trial did not resolve all of the questions it raised, but it established, in a federal courtroom, that the reach of celebrity status has limits, and that those who believe otherwise will, eventually, discover those limits at considerable personal cost. Number 6. Peter Nygard. The fashion mogul's hidden world. There are industries that trade on aspiration, on the promise that entry into their world represents a form of achievement, a crossing of a threshold that most people only dream about. The fashion industry is perhaps the most powerful example of this dynamic. For young men and women who dream of modeling careers, the opportunity to meet someone with influence in that world, someone with a private jet, global connections, and the ability to open doors, can feel like the most significant moment of their professional lives. Peter Nygaard understood this, and according to prosecutors in Canada and investigators in the United States, he used that understanding deliberately and systematically for decades. Nygaard was a former Canadian fashion mogul whose company, Nygaard International, was one of Canada's largest women's wear makers, with 170 stores in Canada and the United States and a global reach that made him a recognized figure in the international fashion industry. He lived extravagantly, maintaining lavish properties in Canada, the United States, and the Bahamas, where he hosted parties at a Mayan-inspired estate that reportedly featured custom-built structures and attracted a steady stream of guests from entertainment, business, and celebrity circles. He cultivated the image of a man who had built an empire through vision and determination, a self-made success story of the kind that the fashion world particularly celebrates. But the details that would eventually emerge from court proceedings painted a picture that was far darker than any of his public appearances suggested. Crown prosecutors in his Toronto trial described how Nygaard used his power and status to lure young women to the private luxury bedroom suite attached to his company headquarters, a room with a large bed, a bar, and doors that had no handles, with locks controlled electronically by Nygaard himself. Victims, ranging in age from 16 to 28 at the time of the alleged incidents, described being invited to tour his headquarters, with the tour invariably concluding in that suite. His trial heard that he had invited them on the pretense of lucrative modeling or other career opportunities, only for them to find themselves in a situation they had not anticipated and had not consented to. Nygaard was found guilty on 4 counts of sexual assault following 6 weeks of trial in November 2023. He appeared to show no emotion as the verdict was delivered. He was subsequently sentenced to 11 years in prison. A spokesperson for one of the victims, whose identity was protected by a court order, read a statement outside the courthouse describing 4 years of difficult legal proceedings and expressing hope that every victim of sexual assault would see in the verdict the strength and confidence to come forward and not be threatened by social status or money. The case did not end there. In July 2026, Nygaard was convicted in Montreal of sexually assaulting and forcibly confining an aspiring 18-year-old model whom he had lured to his Montreal penthouse with promises of advancing her career and offering her a life of luxury in the Bahamas. And he also faces extradition to the United States, where federal prosecutors have charged him with sex trafficking, racketeering, and related offenses. The U.S. indictment alleged that Nygaard capitalized on the global influence of his clothing empire, using its employees, funds, and resources to recruit women and girls, offering false promises of modeling opportunities and career advancement to lure victims, while restricting their movements to isolate them. The number of civil lawsuits filed against him is extraordinary. Legal representatives for more than 130 survivors have described what they characterize as an international trafficking enterprise built on coercion, intimidation, and the systematic exploitation of people who came to Nygaard believing he could help them build careers. The Peter Nygaard case is, at its core, a case about the weaponization of professional aspiration. The fashion industry, with its culture of gatekeepers and its emphasis on access and connection, creates conditions in which the power differential between an established figure and an aspiring young person is particularly pronounced. Nygaard exploited that differential with what prosecutors and a Toronto judge described as a high level of calculated manipulation sustained over a period of decades. His victims were people who wanted to build something for themselves. They walked through a door that appeared to lead somewhere promising. What they found on the other side was something they spent years trying to understand and, ultimately, the courage to speak about in a court of law. Number 7. Rolf Harris, the national treasure who was not what he seemed. Few cases in the history of British celebrity have produced a fall from public grace as dramatic or as disorienting as the case of Rolf Harris. From beloved children's entertainer, bestowed with royal honors, to convicted child sex offender, his fall from grace, when it finally came, was rapid and dramatic. His television career had spanned 7 decades as he entertained generation after generation, and behind the camera, a very different side of his character remained hidden. Harris was born in Perth, Western Australia in 1930, and his path to fame began in the 1950s with novelty songs that became genuine hits on both sides of the world. He was a versatile performer, musician, television presenter, comedian, visual artist, whose warmth and enthusiasm for his craft made him a reassuring and beloved presence in British and Australian homes for more than 5 decades. He painted Queen Elizabeth II's official portrait in 2005 and performed at her Diamond Jubilee concert outside Buckingham Palace in 2012. He was made a commander of the British Empire, one of the highest honors the monarch can bestow. Children who grew up watching his programs, and there were multiple generations of them, associated his name with gentleness, creativity, and good-natured humor. And it was precisely that association that made the findings of his trial in 2014 so profoundly difficult for the public to absorb. Rolf Harris was found guilty of 12 charges of indecently assaulting 4 girls in the United Kingdom over nearly 20 years, starting from 1968. Some of the victims were as young as 7 or 8 years old. London's Southwark Crown Court heard that the assaults against the 4 girls took place between 1968 and 1986. 6 additional women gave supporting evidence describing incidents in Australia, New Zealand, and Malta between 1969 and 1991. Prosecutors said that for years he had gotten away with his conduct because his fame made him untouchable, that he was so famous and powerful that no one felt they could tell the truth about his behavior, and that no one believed victims would be believed if they did speak. One of the victims he was convicted of assaulting was a childhood friend of his own daughter, a detail that became one of the most jarring elements of the case, speaking to both the audacity of his conduct and the degree to which his public persona had insulated him from scrutiny. Those who knew Harris personally described him as a Jekyll and Hyde character, presenting a warm, empathetic public presence while, behind the scenes, taking advantage of his status and the access it afforded him. He was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison. The judge admonished him for an apparent lack of remorse. Following his conviction, Queen Elizabeth stripped Harris of the CBE she had bestowed on him in 2006, and his name was erased from the register of that honor. His trial was conducted as part of Operation Yewtree, the wide-ranging British police investigation launched in 2012 in the wake of revelations about Jimmy Savile, which examined allegations of historic celebrity sexual abuse across the entertainment industry. Harris was the highest-profile figure to be convicted in the Yewtree proceedings, and his case deepened the public conversation about how cultural reputation can function as a form of protection, and about the responsibility of institutions to take seriously the accounts of those who speak up regardless of how celebrated the person they are speaking about may be. Rolf Harris was released from prison in 2017 after serving approximately 3.5 years. He died in May 2023 at the age of 93. By the time of his death, the public image he had spent 70 years constructing had been fundamentally and irrevocably redefined. He had been one of Britain's most trusted and beloved performers. He had been awarded a knighthood's equivalent, had painted the Queen's portrait, had performed before millions. And yet what he had done in private, and what his victims had known but been unable, for years, to make anyone believe, was the truth that ultimately defined his legacy. Number 8. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. The network behind the name. Some cases involve a single individual. Others involve something more complex, a structure, a network, a web of relationships and resources that was constructed deliberately and maintained over a long period of time with a specific purpose. The Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell case falls into the latter category, and it is this structural dimension, the deliberate construction of a system designed to exploit vulnerable young people and then protect the individuals responsible from accountability, that makes it one of the most significant and disturbing cases in the history of celebrity-enabled exploitation. Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy financier who had been previously convicted as a sex offender. In 2019, he was arrested again on sex trafficking and conspiracy charges over allegations that he had paid girls as young as 14 for sex and used them to recruit other young girls over a period of years in the early 2000s. Epstein occupied an unusual position in the social landscape of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He was not a celebrity in the traditional sense. He had not appeared on television or released albums or directed films. His fame was of a different and in some ways more potent variety. He was wealthy, well-connected, and socially positioned in a way that gave him access to presidents, princes, academics, and entertainers. He moved between worlds with a fluency that seemed to confirm his importance, and his apparent legitimacy in those worlds conferred a degree of social protection that proved enormously difficult to penetrate. New records eventually detailed how Epstein leveraged connections to the wealthy and powerful over 3 decades to recruit his victims and cover up his crimes. Unsealed documents from related legal proceedings contained detailed accounts of young victims, many of them high school students, who described being recruited under the impression they were being hired to give him massages that then became something they had never agreed to. Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite and daughter of British media mogul Robert Maxwell, played a central and documented role in the operation of this network. According to prosecutors, Maxwell and her hired assistants enticed hundreds of girls to visit Epstein's homes and nearby locations in New York City, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as well as Maxwell's own residence in London, where they were groomed for encounters with Epstein and other individuals. Prosecutors described how the power couple flaunted their riches and prominent connections to lure vulnerable girls as young as 14 and then exploit them. Epstein sexually abused children hundreds of times over more than a decade, they argued, and could not have done so without the assistance of Maxwell, his longtime companion and one-time girlfriend. Maxwell's trial, which took place in late 2021, was widely seen as the reckoning that Epstein himself, who died by suicide in a federal detention facility in August 2019 while awaiting trial, had never faced. Jurors deliberated for 5 full days before finding Maxwell guilty on 5 of 6 counts, following a month-long trial featuring accounts of the exploitation of girls as young as 14, told by 4 women who described being abused in the 1990s and early 2000s at Epstein's properties. In June 2022, Maxwell was sentenced to 240 months, 20 years, in federal prison for her role in conspiring with Epstein to sexually exploit and abuse multiple minor girls over the course of a decade. The sentencing judge stated that Maxwell had participated in a horrific scheme to lure and traffic underage girls, some as young as 14, and that Maxwell did not appear to express genuine remorse or accept full responsibility for her role. Speaking at her sentencing hearing before learning the sentence, Maxwell had called Epstein a manipulative and controlling man who had deceived everyone around him, including her. The prosecution responded that Maxwell had been an adult who made her own choices. One of the accusers who testified at trial, Annie Farmer, stated outside court that Maxwell had caused harm to many more women than the few who had the chance to testify. The Epstein-Maxwell case raised questions that remain the subject of ongoing legal and investigative scrutiny, about who else may have known about the network, about how it was able to operate for so long across multiple countries and jurisdictions, and about how the social architecture of wealth and celebrity can create spaces where the most fundamental legal and ethical protections simply fail to function as intended. Number 9. Andrew Tate, the influencer who built a following on a false image. The rise of social media created a new category of celebrity, one that does not require a record label, a film studio, or a television network. It requires only an audience and the ability to hold that audience's attention. Andrew Tate built his audience with a carefully constructed identity, the successful, disciplined, hyper-masculine self-made man who had defeated a system that held others back, and who was now willing to share his secrets with those who were paying attention. Andrew Tate, 38 at the time of his arrest, is a former professional kickboxer and self-described misogynist who had amassed a massive social media following, particularly among young men and schoolboys, to the alarm of educators and child safety advocates. He was banned from multiple major social media platforms at various points for violating policies on hateful content, and then reinstated on some of them, and each controversy seemed only to increase his public profile among the audience he was cultivating. He posted videos about luxury cars and private jets, and what he described as the correct philosophy for men who wanted to succeed. Millions watched. Many believed, and that following, that extraordinary digital reach became, according to Romanian prosecutors, the foundation of a scheme that bore no resemblance to the self-help content through which it was built. In December 2022, Tate was detained in Romania along with his brother Tristan Tate and two Romanian women on charges of being part of an organized crime group, human trafficking, and rape. Prosecutors alleged that the British citizens had recruited women who were subjected to acts of physical and psychological coercion, were sexually exploited by members of the group, and were forced to perform acts intended to generate financial benefits for those directing the operation. Romania's Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism formally accused the four defendants of forming an organized crime group to carry out human trafficking in Romania, the United Kingdom, and the United States. 7 alleged victims were identified, described as having been recruited by defendants and misled about their romantic intentions. The alleged victims were then moved to houses where they were subjected to intimidation and were sexually exploited, according to the agency. The case highlighted a particular dimension of celebrity exploitation that differs from the entertainment industry cases described elsewhere in this documentary. Andrew Tate's celebrity was itself built on the kind of image, the powerful, controlling man who makes the rules, that investigators would later allege he was translating into a real-world operation targeting real people. The online persona and the alleged criminal conduct were, in a disturbing way, reflections of each other. As of February 2025, the Tate brothers had left Romania after Romanian authorities lifted the travel restrictions against them, with the brothers arriving in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Criminal proceedings in Romania remain ongoing, and the brothers continue to deny the charges against them. The case is unresolved. No verdict has been delivered, but the allegations, the documentation produced by Romanian prosecutors, and the scale of the investigation represent a significant legal challenge that has permanently altered the public conversation about Tate, about the responsibilities of social media platforms toward the content they host, and about the ways in which a digital celebrity identity can function as a tool for the recruitment of victims in the physical world. Number 10. Gary Glitter. The glitter that hid the darkness. Paul Francis Gadd was born on May 8, 1944, in Banbury, Oxfordshire, and after performing under various stage names throughout the 1960s, he transformed himself into Gary Glitter at the dawn of the glam rock era, accumulating a sustained run of UK chart hits that included Rock and Roll Parts 1 and 2, Do You Want to Touch Me, I Love You Love Me Love, and I'm the Leader of the Gang, which reached number 1 in 1973. He sold over 20 million records, spent 168 weeks in the UK charts, and had 21 hit singles that placed him among the 100 most successful chart acts in British music history, and his performances were events in the truest sense of the word, extraordinary. Theatrical spectacles in which the glitter suits and platform boots and bouffant wigs combined with a relentless physical energy to create something that audiences, particularly young audiences, found genuinely thrilling. Young fans lined up to see him. Young girls, in particular, were drawn to the concerts where he commanded the stage, and it was their trust, their admiration, their awe, their entirely reasonable belief that someone so famous and so celebrated must be worthy of that admiration, that Gary Glitter exploited with deliberate and systematic calculation at the very height of his celebrity. He separated young fans from their mothers by taking them backstage to his dressing room at his shows, preying on vulnerable victims whose claims he believed would never be taken seriously because of his celebrity status. Prosecutors at his eventual trial described what they called the immunity of fame, a phrase that captures, with devastating precision, the mechanism by which Gary Glitter was able to cause profound harm to multiple young children over the course of nearly a decade at the peak of his career, and then continue living his public life for more than 30 years before a court finally held him accountable. The story of Gary Glitter is not simply the story of a fallen entertainer. It is the story of what happens when celebrity creates a presumption of trustworthiness so powerful that the people best positioned to see through it, the children who were harmed, and the adults who might have believed them, find themselves without the protection they most needed. In November 1997, Glitter was taken into custody after an IT specialist found child pornographic material on the hard drive of a laptop he had brought to a computer repair shop in Bristol, and investigators established that the device contained more than 4,000 items of child abuse material. The repair technician, carrying out routine work on an ordinary machine, notified police. A moment so unremarkable in its origins that it underscores how fragile the architecture of concealment constructed by powerful individuals can ultimately prove to be. Glitter appeared at Bristol Crown Court on November 12, 1999, was sentenced by Mr. Justice Butterfield to 4 months in prison, and was placed on the sex offender register in the United Kingdom after admitting to downloading more than 4,000 items of child pornography. He served 2 months before his release, and the brevity of that punishment would, in hindsight, appear deeply inadequate given what would subsequently emerge about the full scope of his conduct across decades. Upon release in January 2000, he left Britain entirely, first to Spain where he lived on a yacht, then to Cuba, then to Cambodia where he was deported in 2002 following suspicions about his behavior, and eventually to Vietnam, where he settled in the southern coastal resort town of Vung Tau and rented a seaside villa with a swimming pool. Neighbors described hearing him singing by the pool and regularly seeing groups of young girls at his home, and he was, in the most literal sense, a registered sex offender who had relocated to a part of the world where he believed his circumstances would afford him ongoing freedom from scrutiny. Having settled in Vietnam, where a British newspaper reported he was living with an underage girl, Glitter was arrested at Ho Chi Minh City Airport in November 2005 while attempting to board a flight to Bangkok, following a week-long police manhunt triggered by allegations that he had been bringing young girls to his villa. In March 2006, a Vietnamese court found him guilty of committing obscene acts with 2 girls aged 10 and 11 at his rented seaside villa in Vung Tau, with the presiding Judge Hong Ton Tung condemning the acts as disgusting and sick in nature, committed repeatedly against the children both at the villa and in nearby hotels. Although Gad disrupted the proceedings by shouting, "I haven't done anything, I'm innocent," he showed no emotion when the verdict was delivered. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, the minimum term under Vietnamese law, later reduced by 3 months, and was released on August 19, 2008, subsequently being refused entry into Thailand and Hong Kong before returning to London. He arrived back in Britain as a man twice convicted in 2 separate countries, still on the UK sex offender register, and still, according to what prosecutors would later establish, carrying no genuine acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. It was not until October 2012, when the Metropolitan Police launched Operation U-Tree in the wake of the Jimmy Savile revelations, that the full picture of Gary Glitter's conduct during his years of peak fame would finally begin to take shape in a British courtroom. Glitter was the very first person to be arrested under Operation U-Tree, taken from his central London home in the early morning hours by officers who described him as cooperative during the arrest itself. The investigation that followed examined his conduct during the 1970s, when he had been at the absolute pinnacle of his celebrity, and what prosecutors established through witness testimony was a pattern that was consistent, calculated, and hidden in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. The trial at Southwark Crown Court heard that Gad had abused his access to young fans in order to create the opportunities to assault and abuse his victims, with Chief Crown Prosecutor Baljit Ubhi stating after the verdict that this access, enabled entirely by his fame, was the primary instrument of the harm he caused. 3 victims gave evidence about offenses that had taken place between 1975 and 1980. One victim had been less than 10 years old when Gad entered her bed and attempted to assault her at a private home. 2 other victims, aged 12 and 13, had been taken backstage at one of his concerts, separated from their mothers by the allure and authority of his celebrity, and subjected to conduct that one of them described, for decades later, as something that had never left her. Detective Chief Inspector Michael Orchard, speaking after the conviction, stated directly, "Paul Gad has shown himself to be a habitual predator who took advantage of the star status afforded to him by targeting young girls who trusted him and were in awe of his fame. His lack of remorse and his insistence that the victims were lying makes his crimes all the more indefensible." The jury, composed of 5 men and 7 women, convicted Glitter on February 5, 2015, of 1 count of attempted rape, 4 counts of indecent assault, and 1 count of sexual intercourse with a girl under the age of 13. all offenses committed during the 1970s when he was among the most recognizable entertainers in the United Kingdom. He raised his eyebrows and appeared shocked as the verdicts were read. He blew kisses to the gallery as he was remanded in custody. On February 27, 2015, Judge Alistair McCreth sentenced Gary Glitter to 16 years in prison at Southwark Crown Court, telling him directly, "It is difficult to overstate the depravity of this dreadful behavior. You did all of them real and lasting damage, and you did so for no other reason than to obtain sexual gratification for yourself of a wholly improper kind." The judge added that he could find no real evidence that Gad had atoned in any way for his actions, and noted that one victim had only come forward nearly 40 years after the assault, when she saw that he had admitted to child pornography charges in 1999, meaning that the silence of his victims, maintained for decades, was itself a product of the culture of celebrity protection that had surrounded him throughout his working life. Glitter served half of his 16-year sentence and was released from HM Prison, the Verne in Dorset on February 3, 2023, at the age of 79, subject to license conditions. The release prompted public outcry in the United Kingdom, with survivors' advocates and members of parliament calling for the law governing automatic halfway release to be reviewed in cases involving the most serious offenses against children. His victims, who had waited nearly 40 years before their accounts were heard in court, found themselves once again facing the reality that the legal system, even when it delivers a conviction, does not always deliver the outcome that the gravity of the harm demands. The Gary Glitter case is, at its core, a case about three specific things that recur throughout this documentary in case after case. It is about the presumption of innocence that attaches to fame, the deeply embedded social instinct that someone beloved by millions simply could not be capable of what they are being accused of. It is about the silence that presumption enforces on the people most harmed, children who had no framework for understanding what had been done to them, and who grew into adults who knew that the name of the person who had harmed them carried a weight that their own accounts might not be able